Welcome to Wealthy Behavior, talking money and wealth with Heritage Financial, the podcast that digs into the topics, strategies, and behaviors that help busy and successful people build and protect their personal wealth. I'm your host, Sammy, the president and CEO of Heritage Financial, a Boston-based wealth management firm working with high net worth families across the country for longer than 25 years. Now let's talk about the wealthy behaviors that are key to a rich life. On this episode of Wealthy Behavior, we have an extra special guest, Allison Schrager, an economist, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor at City Journal, a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, and co-founder of LifeCycle Partners, LLC, a risk advisory firm. She's been a regular contributor to The Economist, Reuters, and Bloomberg Businessweek, and her work has appeared in numerous other publications. She's also the author of An Economist Walks into a Brothel and Other Unexpected Places to Understand Risk. We're going to talk today about that book, retirement, and Social Security. Allison, welcome to Wealthy Behavior. We're really excited to have you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So why did The Economist walk into the brothel, and how does that connect to retirement planning?
Initially, I was looking for interesting stories, actually, for a book when I had a very vague book idea of what I wanted to do. I thought it would be fun to take financial theory and give it a Freakonomics treatment and show how these principles that we use in finance of thinking about how to put a price on risk really apply to all industries. So this was my idea. But unlike Freakonomics, I didn't have the research history Steve Levitt did, and I didn't have any good stories. So I needed to find them, and I had no idea how. And so long story short, I met this woman who runs a brothel in New York. I mean, it's an illegal business because sex isn't legal in New York, or sex is not sex. Getting paid for it.
Yes.
So what she did is she matched people online looking for sex workers who are submissives. It's a very dangerous job. So she did all the screening, and she got 30% cut for ensuring that this would be a safe transaction for both parties. And I was like, oh, it's like a risk premium. Great. It's a great risk story. So I wrote this story. It did really well, as you can imagine. And the Bunny Ranch saw it, and they were like, why don't you write a story about us? Because, we're like the big brothel, and why are you writing with this small time person in New York? And I was like, I don't know, I don't really write about brothels. I'm a retirement economist, but I'm going to talk to you because this is interesting. And I remember them explaining to me how there's not a set price. Every negotiation is individually negotiated. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. You've got young women negotiating with rich men for tens of thousands of dollars. And they explained to me that, yeah, and it's really interesting. The women here are very shy about negotiating, so we have a negotiation training program. And we know this is an issue for women in all industries. So I remember thinking, well, that's unusual. So I had a wonderful editor at the time who was like, you must go. I never really done that. I'm an economist who writes sometimes, so I never really reported before. I talk to people on the phone and be like, well, what are your thoughts on this financial theory, but not going somewhere. So yeah, they sent me there with a videographer to learn about how negotiation skills are taught in a brothel. And along the way, part of that was figuring out how things are priced, because I'm an economist, so I always want to know that. And I discovered all these really intricate risk stories there. So I realized it would be great for the book.
Yeah, and you put the great book together, which we'll get into in a bit. I wanted to start with Social Security, if we could. There was a recent report that the Social Security trust funds are projected to be depleted. I think it's in 2035, although the year keeps changing. What does that mean, I guess, as a starting point when they say it'll be depleted by a certain date?
Well, that's just, so for a lot of years, we took in more in taxes than we paid out in benefits. So, I mean, whether or not the trust fund exists, I think is a philosophical question, but let's, for the just sake of argument, assume it does, because the extra money was invested in bonds. So the government effectively led, for one part of the government lent to the other. And so we've stopped taking in what we're paying out, and so now we're drawing down that trust fund, I guess, that mythical trust fund of bonds. And so when that happens, we're still taking in less than we're paying out. So at that point, I think the estimate is 25%, something in there, of shortfall of benefits. So in theory, worst case scenario is everyone gets across the board 20% benefit cut.
And what does that mean, across the board, the scheduled benefits? Is that people who are already on Social Security?
Yes.
And how about people who aren't, but are paying into the system?
So it would just be, Yeah, it would just be everyone takes a 20% cut. I don't think that will happen.
Yep.
It would be bad. I'm not endorsing that. I mean, but when people say Social Security won't be there for me, I just want to say that is the worst case scenario. That would be bad. I don't believe that will ever happen. I think if you look at any sort of debt crises, somehow pensioners are always paid first. So I think would sooner default on the US bonds before we would not make a Social Security payment or cut it a lot. But we have to do something. Something needs to happen between now and 2035.
So you're
to
in the
avoid
camp that there is this projected shortfall, but it's not going to happen. It can't happen.
Well, no,
How did
we got to do something. Like,
yeah,
I
sure.
think a lot of the people who are like, there's a more people than not are like, we can just ignore this and things will somehow work out. I am not that person, but I don't think we'll ever just cut benefits. And I think Social Security will be there for everyone. We'll just have to give up some other things for that to be true.
And how did we get to this point? Is it because I remember back when Al Gore was running for president and SNL was making fun of him because they had this locks box where he wanted to put Social Security money into it. Is it something in terms of mismanagement of funds prior, or is it just demographics and there's just not enough people to support the retirees?
It's just demographics.
Okay.
I mean, it's a pay-as-you-go system. Every country that's a pay-as-you-go system, and actually even more, are facing this problem. In fact, facing this problem even worse than we are, just because, it's pay-as-you-go in that people retire and when they work, they paid for other retirees. And so now we just have more old people relative to young people. And back when Social Security started, you got a great return on your Social Security taxes just because there were so many young people for every retired person.
Would immigration help fix the mismatch in terms of retirees to people paying into the system? Legal immigration.
Yeah, it would need a lot of them though.
Okay.
I think what we need is a combination of a lot of things. I don't think there's any one magic bullet that would help. But the number of people would need to bring in to make the system whole would probably be politically untenable.
So what are some of the fixes and maybe some of the more reasonable ones or ones that you could see kind of coming into fruition?
Other than, I said, make more workers, become more productive. Everyone like that. I'm not sure how that happens. That's probably the closest thing we have to a free lunch, but I wouldn't count on that, or certainly not enough. Other than that, it's increase taxes or cut benefits. It's a simple math problem.
And so if you cut benefits, which not necessarily going to the 20, 25, 30% cut, there are ways to phase in delaying benefits for future retirees. There are ways to maybe change how inflation is calculated so the benefits don't grow as quick. Are you putting those two in the camp of?
They're
Okay.
all benefit cuts. I mean, we can call them a lot of different things. Raising the retirement age is a benefit cut. I said changing the indexation is a benefit cut. Just changing the progressivity of it is a benefit cut. It's not a bad thing. I mean, we're going to have to do probably some tax increases and some benefit cuts. But I think we should get. I mean, everyone sort of is like, oh, benefit cut can't do it. But, that's just realistic. I mean, people freak out at the idea of increasing the retirement age because it's a benefit cut. And it is. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
It does seem that from what I've seen that you can phase in a raising of the retirement age over a very extended period. That does a lot to bolster the system. It's not as if you're changing it drastically for a group that's right around the corner from retirement.
Yeah, we did it in the 80s. It made a big difference. Social Security ran out of money then too, and it put us on track for, 50 years. It's a good thing. I'm a big fan of the idea of working longer. Not only is it really good for Social Security, it's good for your personal finances. It makes a huge difference, as you know, when you're helping someone finance retirement, even having, say, 20, 30% of their working income coming in still as a retiree makes a huge sense. It's also good for people, I think, emotionally. It's an important part of healthy aging is having a sense of purpose and socialization. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits. It is true. I mean, people get very upset when you bring it up because either some people just actually do have very physically demanding jobs and can't work longer, or, age discrimination, I think is also a huge issue we're going to have to address. That it's, a lot of people get phased out of work by their employer and they don't have a job anymore. So I think, again, these are all policy things. I think if we could just get around the idea that, hey, working longer is a good goal, we could come up with policies to address those hurdles because I don't think they're insurmountable.
If you were building financial plans for three groups, And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but it does connect to your book in terms of kind of understanding and managing risk. If you had three groups of people, people on Social Security, people who are over 55, and people who are under 55, and you wanted to take a reasonable guess at what their Social Security would be compared to, what it's projected to be now, without taking too much risk of being wrong and kind of building an overly optimistic or pessimistic financial plan. Do you have a thought in mind for financial planners or retirees, how to think about that?
No, it's so unpredictable. I mean, I would guess it's going to be roughly the same. I think working longer means like the actual benefit, you have fewer years of benefit, and that's the way it's a benefit cut. You mentioned changing the indexation. Again, how your sort of index you're using in your plan might be similar to what the new index would be anyway. So that it's just too hard to predict. So I don't know. If I was building a sort of an algorithm that projected retirement income that includes Social Security, I'd also take the CBO stance, which is this is so unpredictable. I'm just going to assume it's the same, because honestly, I don't think it will be that different. People really like their retirement benefits. I think any cut will be meaningful, but sort of backdoor at the same time, so people won't really notice it.
Yeah, so it sounds like, this idea of taking it out of the financial plan completely would be off the table, doing some kind of modest benefit cut if you wanted to, or delaying when you get it would be reasonable, but, don't be drastic in either direction.
That's insane. I mean, think about it. Like if you at most you might be getting like $55,000 a year inflation indexed income. I mean, that is for most people a huge piece of their retirement income.
Yeah.
And to just assume you're not going to get that. I mean, I know people do. Even my parents who are already in retirement, like are sort of like, well, I don't know if it's gonna be there next year. It's like, of course it's gonna be there next year. So as I said, like politically, I don't see it going away. It is, I mean, $50,000 in inflation indexed income a year is worth a lot of money. It's like $1 million, especially because it's, there's no risk associated with it. You'll have it as long as you live, no matter how long you live. So I said, think about what a $50,000 inflation indexed annuity costs.
Right.
So how could you leave that out?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'm glad we had this conversation, and it's good, feedback for people to, build, I think, more realistic assumptions. So pivoting to your book, when you came up with the idea, I always like to ask authors this: when you came up with the idea for the book, how did you explain it to friends and family that weren't economists or weren't in your industry?
After I left DFA, I had a writing background. I had a financial background. I learned my background. I'm an economist who always specialized in retirement. And I felt like there were a lot of things people needed to understand about basic finance that we weren't really teaching, and I thought could be better understood, and honestly needed to be understood for people to get a grip on their personal finances, and particularly about saving and investing for retirement. So it was like, Freakonomics was so powerful, and it really educated people how economists think. So I thought it would be a good idea to put something out there so people understand how financial economists think. But we could make it fun and relatable and tell stories that people would actually enjoy reading. So that was pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very enjoyable. It makes a lot of great points, and the stories that you found, the people that you highlighted were excellent. So you share 5 principles for dealing with risk based on the premise that risk is unavoidable. And as you pointed out, most of us don't know how to measure it and maximize our chances of getting what we want out of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So biggest mistake you say what people make when they take a risk isn't having a well-defined goal.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you don't just like go out there and take risks for a sake. You take a risk because it's supposed to bring you closer to something you want. It could be more money. It could be a secure retirement. It could be just taking a vacation next year. But, like anything, your risk is a lot more likely to be successful if you have a well-defined goal. So it's not just like, oh, I'm gonna bet on crypto or on a sports game just because I like to add a little risk to my life. I mean, maybe you're doing that just for fun, in which case that is your goal.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're, I'm betting on sports games because I'm hoping I have a more secure retirement, you can see that that's not such a good idea. And also, I mean, it's important also in terms of how you define what your risk-free asset is. because that also helps you measure how much risk you're taking. It helps you see clearly what your goal is. And this is a issue I think we have in the retirement industries. We largely have misspecified what we mean by risk-free. And I think that also sort of throws people off and makes the whole retirement problem a lot harder for people than it needs to be.
So you shared a great example of if you're buying your dream house, your biggest risk is that you don't get the house.
Mhm.
So, you should be willing to overpay for that house.
Yeah.
But if your goal is to have a good investment for a variety of reasons, you shouldn't be willing to overpay, and that should impact how you make your offer. How do you balance certain goals? Like if your goal is to get a good deal, or if
Mhm.
kind of a combination of the two, I could see how it gets complicated putting two objectives together, like saving for retirement, but also saving for my kids' college education, which can be in conflict sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes it hard is that often you do have two competing goals. And I mean, you want to have a great retirement, but you also want to enjoy life while you're working. I mean, I'm not a fan of saving absolutely everything and not taking a vacation during your working years or not giving your children that experience. I mean, that's also important. I mean, as I said, it's a multidimensional problem. And and if that's hard for everyone to solve. So I think you just do need to have some balance. Like back to the house example, is if just getting this house and that's all that matters, yeah, overpay for it. But if you're looking for a deal, then you should try to underpay for it. But if you're somewhere in the middle, maybe just, pay the market price for it. And if it's significantly above the market price, then just walk away. Like have maybe little rules that
Yeah.
keep you from getting too emotional and fixated on one goal versus the other.
Yeah, no, you touched on that in a different section, which does make a lot of sense. You shared something that was very eye-opening to me because we've been thinking a lot about it, I think, at our firm and as an industry. This idea of you start your relationship with your wealth manager or your investment manager by filling out a risk management questionnaire.
Mhm.
And, don't start with a risk management questionnaire. You really should be starting with a goal of what future income you want to have if you're talking to an individual, right? What's the
Mhm.
money doing for you? How did you get to that, and just in terms of that understanding?
Well, I think it's just I come to this with more academic training. And then when I was at DFA, I worked with Robert Merton, and even before we went to DFA, we went there together for years about really what is optimal life cycle finance look like. And, in economics, I mean, we actually do have this is how risk averse you are, and then we plug it into a model. But I have never found it particularly meaningful in my research, especially because I find that like it's sort of a nonsense thing to say I'm risk averse, I'm not risk averse. Because I find people are always risk averse in some aspect of their life, but then not in others, or depending on the situation or their age, or like things totally change. Like in the book, I talked about how I went to a conference of big wave surfers. Like these are people who take risks I think are insane. Yet they all have their thing. Like I think one told me he's afraid to invest in the stock market. I mean, everyone kind of has the risks they're comfortable with. And someone who can be very risk tolerant in one ways can be risk averse in others. And I think these risk questionnaires, I said they often can be abstract. Like, how would you feel if you lost money, on a given day? Well, I mean, if it's in your retirement account, maybe you'll be okay with it because you probably won't even know. And, the odds are decent that the market will come back. So that's very different than, your emergency fund losing money. So I'm not sure that like risk averse, not risk averse has any real meaning. I think instead you want to think about, reaching your goal. Is that realistic? How much risk are you willing to take in pursuit of that goal?
Yeah, so we start with the goal by building a financial plan for people,
Mhm.
right? Just knowing where we're going, and that does drive a lot of the asset allocation conversation. And I do think at certain points in the book, you get into that a little bit more. You talk about when you have less at stake to lose, you tend to stay more rational.
Mhm.
And would that lead to the advice that maybe your asset allocation in retirement shouldn't be all equity, or it shouldn't be riskier than you would like, because you just have an opportunity then to hold to the portfolio even during times of market distress?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing. I mean, the way we thought about it when I was working with Merton was, you take, a reasonable amount of risk, and if you have enough money, you should like just de-risk and get yourself out of the market. I don't know if I still agree with that. I haven't, it would really depend on the person. And maybe once they reach their goal, they'd want to have a new goal. I'm of the mind that a certain amount of risk taking is healthy, but for some people it's not. So I don't know. It said it's hard to say, but I'd focus more on having the right equity investments. There's certainly no guarantees with them, but making sure you're well diversified
Hmm.
and well informed. I mean, the thing is, it's trickier now than when I wrote the book, because I wrote the book when we were still like zero rate environment, and it seemed like I always believed rates would go up eventually, but I was getting to feel like a crank saying so. So I kind of was just like, all right, zero rates forever, and if you want to get any return, you have to take some risk. But now, I'm just it's so much harder to say because it looks like, rates might still be going up long to medium term. So, to put your entire retirement savings in bonds now maybe not be the great idea it used to be. I mean, because the zero return is better than, bond funds losing money. I think the main principle I'd have with retirement finance now is just diversify as much as you can.
Yep, absolutely. So you talk about broad framing, viewing each hand as part of a larger game. Can
Mhm.
you kind of explain that concept a little bit and how it connects to maybe ignoring a bad day or even a bad few months in the
Mhm.
market?
Yeah, so this is when I interviewed Phil Hellmuth, who's a famous poker player, about how I found it so he was such an interesting guy because he's known for having thrown these tantrums all the time. But he actually, when it comes to play, a very disciplined player, very patient, doesn't play most of the hands, which I guess is important when you play poker if you want to win long term. And it is you can't just and this is it. It's like you can just be in one hand and just think this is it. And I think you can think that about retirement finance as well. Like, one bear market. It's always amazing to me that people talk about the financial crisis and they're like, I lost 40% of my portfolio. And I was like, well, where is it now? I'm like, well, it's like, up 110% from when I started. I'm like, okay. So you lost 40%, but then it came back. But they talk about it still as if, I'm not minimizing that. And a lot of people had to draw down assets at that point and taken those losses forever. So not saying it was a good thing, but it certainly wasn't like, oh, I lost this money and I'll never get it back. It was like, this is the nature of doing something that's risky, which is there are going to be bad years. And if you stuck with it, you probably came out ahead in the end. And that's the nature of risky investing. So I think you just said you can't just look at that one year. You have to look at, stock investing over many decades of there's no guarantees. We could end up repeating Japan. Going forward, we could end up with a bear market for decades. It's certainly on the table, but generally, that doesn't happen and you are investing for the long term.
Yeah. And then you get to one of the rules of risk that you share is be master of your domain,
Mhm.
which talks about controlling risk by hedging and buying insurance. And I couldn't help but thinking for some reason about long-term care insurance
Mhm.
as well, A, obviously it's a form of insurance, but B, it does hedge a little bit against market risk. And how do you think about long-term care insurance for retirees as part of their mix?
I mean, it's wonderful if you can afford it. Especially, we don't do a good job really sort of educating people about the costs of retirement and, long-term care, huge costs. No one wants to be in a terrible nursing home with bed sores and like dependent on Medicaid. But the problem is it's very expensive. And not only are you really hedging a market risk, one of the reasons long-term care is so expensive is it's very labor intensive. And I don't think the cost of labor is going to go down anytime soon. In fact, we call this sort of cost disease, which is, the value of labor goes up quicker even than the rest of the economy. You could end up, the cost of long-term care could feasibly really outpace inflation or even GDP growth. So it's a very, very valuable insurance. The problem is because it's such a valuable insurance, it's also incredibly expensive. I think as well, the insurance companies realize a lot of the people who buy long-term care insurance probably had parents who needed it and probably will need it themselves. And insurance is cheaper if most people who buy it don't need it.
Yep.
And most people who are buying it probably are going to need it. So I think it's a market. Again, I think when we think about retirement, we don't really need to overhaul the system as much as people think, but we do need to make certain things work better and be more accessible. And I think health care and retirement, a lot of people are never going to be able to afford long-term care, so we just need better options through Medicaid and social insurance. One way to, I guess, make it more affordable is to, I don't know, more affordable, but have lower premiums, is to get into a plan as early as you can.
Yeah. We were wondering years ago, I guess, not anytime recently, why there weren't more kind of catastrophic long-term care policies where,
Mm-hmm.
you would cover yourself for the first year
Mm-hmm.
and really the policy would kick in, after that huge deductible as a way to bring down costs. So there has been innovation in the space with different
Mm-hmm.
types of policies, but I don't know that we've seen that yet. Do you
Yeah,
mind?
I just said I wrote my Bloomberg column this week on Mark Rowan and his foray into the annuity world. And his view is everyone should be in private equity even when they're in the accumulation phase, which I disagree with. But I did say, the fact that all these private equity guys are getting into the annuity space and retirement insurance space, actually, I think that's kind of good. I mean, assuming, there's not a big financial blow up and it's well regulated and all those caveats. But I kind of feel like a lot of these parts of the market have sort of never gotten the interest. It's never been considered all that sexy.
Mhm.
So I think it's great that private equity is getting more interested in it, because it could just mean smarter minds working on the problem and more innovation. And, assuming they don't lever us up with like bad private credit, I think there could be something really good there, that this is getting to be considered a sexier part of finance and more people are working on it. So maybe we'll get better stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are the main problems with the retirement system that we have now?
I think we've pretty much gotten pretty good at the saving part.
Okay.
We have, 401k coverage is pretty good. I think the auto enrollment and auto investing has solved a lot of the problems we have around people participating and people being in a vaguely reasonable plan. I have some issues with target date funds, but broadly they're okay than what people were doing before, so I'll take it. The problem is, and it's amazing to me that we haven't really thought more carefully about this, is what do people do when they actually retire? Like, we don't have good spending plans and everyone wants something really simple, but it's not a simple problem. The spend down problem is probably, was it Bill Sharp said, the hardest problem in finance? And everyone just wants like a rule of thumb, and it's completely inadequate for the risks that people face. And I think the solutions that people are largely using now are terrible. It means incredibly variable income for year to year. And like, this is more variable income than would expect workers to live with, yet we expect retirees to live with. It's ridiculous. So I think we really need to think more. And as I said, this is why I welcome all smart people getting involved in this. What spending in retirement looks like and how that's financed.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess that probably doesn't even start to contemplate some of the tax problems that you have in terms of spending down different buckets in the orders that you should, and what's the most tax efficient way to draw down those assets. You're talking more about just what's a reasonable number to target and how to get it.
Yeah, and how you should
Yeah.
be investing your money, and how much insurance you should have,
Yeah.
be it an annuity or long-term care. As I said, just like it's a very, I mean, it's such a complicated problem. You don't know how long you're going to live. You still have market risk. Consumption in retirement changes a lot. As they say, 70 is the new 50, but 80 is still 80, which means in your 70s, you're probably going to like have a great time. You're going to be traveling a lot, hopefully, and, still being very active. Then you hit your 80s, you don't really go anywhere. And then generally you have some sort of catastrophic health event that can be very expensive. And you don't know when these things are going to happen. It's going to shift. I mean, some people are still traveling and taking great trips when they're 85. Other people can't once they're 72. So it's fairly unpredictable about when that is going to change. So, I mean, this is just an incredibly difficult thing to finance. And never even mind the market risk you have to deal with and all the levels of insurance. So I think we definitely need to be thinking more help. And as I said, you even bring up taxes, which a lot of people have said sort of are naive to the taxes that they face when they are actually going to retire.
Yeah, absolutely. And the different buckets and what causes them, and some tax planning they can do along the way. Because, coming out of your book talking about this topic, you're not a fan of the 4% rule.
No, I mean, it's a completely inadequate solution for an incredibly complicated problem. I think people always want like a simple solution to hard problems, and sometimes that works, but a lot of times it's too simple for the problem. And, first of all, there's something kind of agnostic about it for really important things. Like, how are you supposed to be financed while you run this down? There's no like real answer there. I mean, but that makes a huge difference. Is it 4% the day of what you had on the day one of retirement, or 4% each year based on your current asset balance?
The way I understand it is it's 4% in year one, and then you just index that for inflation from years two and beyond.
Yeah, but like, how do you invest your money? I mean, what if you have a couple of years of bad losses? Then that becomes inadequate. I mean, it as I said, never mind. I said the fact that like your consumption needs change a lot. I think people, if they can afford it and they have a plan, should really be living it up in their 70s if they have the health to do it. I mean, if you can afford to, you'd be taking your grandkids to Disney World. Like, have those memories, build them while you can, rather than because you might have a period where you physically can't do this stuff. So this idea that you're going to be spending the same year to year doesn't really make much sense either.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I understand. Yeah, they have that retirement smile, right? Where, which you just described, you're spending early on fun things, then you're sitting at home, and then
Mhm.
you have healthcare costs at the end. And how do you project, and how do you use the 4% rule if you're going to use something like that within that smile? And then, when your costs pick up later for healthcare, are you going to offset some of that with insurance or other means? Or so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges there
It's
for
also
sure.
just inefficient. I mean, if you are thinking about, can I even suppose you want a stable consumption spending, you could, the 4% rule is just like you need to invest your assets in a way to make that 4% rule happen. You'll get more for your money if you do that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's not all encompassing in terms of, it drives the portfolio recommendations and everything else along the way. I do find value in it with clients, as as they're approaching retirement, just mentally explaining to them like, yeah, if you stick to 4% in the first year before we build a plan, and you just want to know if that's probably going to be sustainable during retirement, that'll probably be sustainable during retirement if you have a good investment plan along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But there are definitely challenges to anything you try to simplify in finance, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean in that way, I mean, I always just divide it by divide your net worth by 20, which is roughly an inflation indexed annuity, which is this is a similar thing.
Similar thing. Yeah. I've seen multiply your income by 25. Scott Galloway's new book talked about that. Is there anything else on your mind as it relates to the retirement space before we get you out of here? Because I've really enjoyed the conversation so far, and I think our listeners are going to find tremendous value in it.
I think the main thing I want people to realize is people talk about it as if this is this disaster that we've never faced before. And I think the data suggests that the generation retiring now, baby boomers, are probably the best prepared financially for retirement than ever before. It doesn't mean that there's not problems. It doesn't mean that everyone has enough money for the retirement they would like, but it is relatively better than previous generations. And I think we should appreciate that. And once we accept that, find ways to make what we've got work even better.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for your time, Allison. I would definitely recommend that people read An Economist Walks into a Brothel. Where else can people find you and your work?
I write a weekly column for Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm at the Manhattan Institute doing various stuff too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Wealthy Behavior. If you found the conversation useful, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode so those around you can live a rich life too. We appreciate your feedback and questions. Please email us at wealthybehavior@heritagefinancial.net. For more insights, subscribe to our weekly blog at heritagefinancial.net and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Check out my personal finance blog at thebostonadvisor.com. Wealthy Behavior is produced by Kristen Kastner and Michelle Kakanis.
This educational podcast is brought to you by Heritage Financial Services, LLC, located in the greater Boston area. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are that of the speaker, are subject to change, and do not constitute investment advice or a recommendation regarding any specific product or security. There is no guarantee that any investment or strategy discussed will be successful or will achieve any particular level of results. Investing involves risks, including the potential loss of principal. There has not been and will not be any compensation exchanged between Heritage Financial Services and podcast guests or recommended resources.